This is the story of a man born free in Virginia. His freedom was documented, recognized, accepted. Years later, that record was changed. Not because of a crime, not because of rebellion, but because the system allowed a correction to erase a life. What you're about to hear is how that happened, and why it was legal. And once you hear how it was done, you'll realize this didn't just happen to him. It could happen to anyone who trusts a system more than the people running it. He was born free. His birth record said so, clear as day. His mother was free. Her name was right there beside his. For years, no one questioned it. He lived his life, worked with his hands, raised a family. Then one day, in an office he never set foot in, a clerk picked up a pen and made a correction. No arrest, no trial, no warning, just a few strokes of ink. And when that ink dried, a free man legally became property. This is not a story about rebellion or escape. It's about how paperwork quietly decided who belonged to whom. I'm your name, and I've spent years digging through old courthouse records, chasing down these forgotten cases. What happened to this man happened to thousands, and most of us have never heard their names. Stay with me, because once you see how easily it was done, you'll wonder how any of us can ever feel completely safe. Let's start with the man himself. His name was Elias Freeman, born in 1805 in a small county along the James River in Virginia. His mother, Clara Freeman, was a free woman of color. She had earned her freedom years earlier after serving as an indentured servant. And when Elias came into the world, the parish register recorded it plainly. Elias, son of Sarah Freeman, free. That single line was supposed to protect him for life. It was the proof he carried, the reason no one could lay claim to him. Growing up, Elias knew he was free, the way most of us know we belong to our families, was simply fact, written down and accepted by everyone around him. Sarah raised him on her own, working as a washerwoman and cook for local families. She made sure he understood the value of that freedom. She told him stories about her own mother, who had come over from Africa and somehow, through years of labor and a stroke of mercy, walked away free. Sarah wanted Elias to have what she had fought for, the right to choose his own work, his own wife, his own future. And for a long time, he did. As a young boy, Elias went to the fields with other free children, not as slaves, but as helpers, earning a few cents for their families. People in the community knew him. The storekeeper greeted him by name. The blacksmith who later took him on as an apprentice never asked for an owner's permission, because Elias didn't have one. When he turned 18, he stood in front of the county clerk himself and registered as a free Negro, just as the law required. He paid the fee, got his certificate, folded it carefully, and kept it close. That piece of paper went everywhere with him, tucked inside his shirt, next to his skin. It was his shield. By his early 20s, Elias had married Clara, a free woman whose family lived a few miles away. They rented a small cabin, started having children, and Elias worked steady hours at the forge. He was good at it, strong, reliable, the kind of man neighbors trusted. On Sundays they went to church together, sat in the section reserved for free people of color, sang the same hymns as everyone else. Life wasn't easy, money was tight, taxes on free blacks were heavy, but it was theirs. Elias could look his children in the eye and say, "You are free, just like me. No one can take that away." But underneath that ordinary life, there was always a quiet fear. Elias saw what happened to others. He heard about free men and women stopped on the road, asked for papers, sometimes taken anyway if a white man claimed them. He knew the patrols rode at night, looking for anyone who couldn't prove their status fast enough. So he checked his certificate regularly, made sure the ink hadn't faded, kept it dry when it rained. Clara sewed a little oilskin pouch for it so it would stay safe. They never talked about it openly in front of the children, but both of them felt it, that low, constant hum of worry that one day someone might decide their papers weren't good enough, and the laws were changing. After 1806, Virginia required every free black person to register every year and carry proof at all times. Miss a year and you could be fined or forced to leave the state. Some counties started charging extra taxes just on free people of color, as if to push them out. Word spread about kidnappers who grabbed free families and sold them south before anyone could protest. Elias listened to these stories and told himself, "We're careful. We've got the record. We're known here." He believed the courthouse ledger, the one with his birth entry, would always back him up. He had no idea that ledger could be changed. What Elias didn't know was that the protections he trusted were only as strong as the people holding the pen. In those years, being free if you were black meant carrying evidence every single day. The first and strongest proof was your birth record, like the one Elias had in the parish book. If your mother was free when you were born, you were free. That was the law, written clear in Virginia code. Courts accepted those parish and county registers as official. Clerks copied them into big ledgers that were supposed to last forever. Elias's entry was there, plain and simple, copied over when the old book wore out. But birth records weren't the only proof. Churches kept their own books. When Elias was baptized as a baby, the minister wrote down his name and status, free. Later, when he married Clara, the same church recorded them both as free people of color. Those church records carried weight too. If a patrol stopped you and you didn't have your papers on you, sometimes a preacher or deacon could vouch and get you released. People trusted the church. Then there was community recognition. In small counties, everybody knew who belonged to whom. Elias had lived in the same area his whole life. White farmers who hired him for extra work knew he was free. The storekeeper let him buy on credit because he was known as reliable and free. Neighbors would testify in court if needed. That everyday knowledge mattered because most disputes over status happened right there in local courts, and local people decided them, and finally, there were the free papers themselves. After 1806, every free black adult in Virginia had to register at the courthouse once a year. You paid a fee, the clerk wrote down your name, age, height, any scars, and stated you were free. Then he gave you a certificate with the county seal. Elias did this faithfully. His registration described him as Elias Freeman, about 5 feet 10 inches, light complexion, born free in this county. That paper was your lifeline. You showed it to patrols, to sheriffs, to anyone who challenged you. Most free people kept it on them at all times. Women sewed hidden pockets in dresses. Men carried them in wallets or tied inside their clothes. All these layers, birth record, church record, community knowledge, annual registration, were supposed to protect you. People thought if you had all of them lined up, you were safe. Elias had every single one. His mother had made sure of it. Clara helped him keep track of the renewals. They thought they were covered, but there were cracks in the system, cracks that certain people knew how to use. Clerks could make notes in the margins. Old entries could be questioned years later. A powerful white man could bring in his own witnesses and claim an old debt or a forgotten manumission mistake. And if the judge wanted to believe him, the judge could order a correction. That's all it took, one order. One new line in the ledger, and everything else. The birth record, the church book, the community memory, suddenly didn't matter as much. I've sat in those old courthouses myself, turning the pages of books just like the ones that held Elias's name. The ink is faded now, but you can still see where lines were drawn through entries, where new words were squeezed in. Sometimes there's a note, corrected per court order, no explanation, no trial record attached. Just the correction, and a life changed forever. That's where Elias's story turns. One morning in 1828, he left for the forge, like always. By evening, patrols were waiting for him. His papers, the ones he carried next to his heart, were declared invalid. The birth record that said he was free had been changed. A new line said his mother had actually been enslaved at the time of his birth. Therefore, by law, he belonged to the man who now claimed her old owner's estate. Clara ran to the courthouse the next day, children trailing behind her, begging the clerk to show the old record. He showed her the book. The correction was there, neat and official. She asked how it could happen without anyone telling them. The clerk shrugged. Court order, he said. Nothing he could do. Elias was gone by then, taken to the claimant's plantation 20 miles away. Clara never got to say goodbye. The children asked for their father every night. She had no money for a lawyer, no way to fight a court that had already ruled. This wasn't kidnapping in the dark. This was legal re-enslavement, done in daylight with ink and paper. And it happened because the system let one man's word outweigh every document, every neighbor, every church record that said otherwise. What did that change mean in daily life? Everything. Elias went from earning wages to working under the lash. He could no longer walk to town without a pass. He couldn't protect his family. If he spoke back, he could be whipped. If he tried to run, he could be sold farther south, away from Clara and the children forever. His skills at the forge were now used to make tools for the plantation that owned him. Every swing of the hammer reminded him what he had lost. Clara ran to the courthouse the next day, children trailing behind her, begging the clerk to show the old record. He showed her the book. The correction was there, neat and official. She asked how it could happen without anyone telling them. The clerk shrugged. Court order, he said. Nothing he could do. Elias was gone by then, taken to the claimant's plantation 20 miles away. Clara never got to say goodbye. The children asked for their father every night. She had no money for a lawyer, no way to fight a court that had already ruled. This wasn't kidnapping in the dark. This was legal re-enslavement, done in daylight with ink and paper. And it happened because the system let one man's word outweigh every document, every neighbor, every church record that said otherwise. What did that change mean in daily life? Everything. Elias went from earning wages to working under the lash. He could no longer walk to town without a pass. He couldn't protect his family. If he spoke back, he could be whipped. If he tried to run, he could be sold farther south, away from Clara and the children forever. His skills at the forge were now used to make tools for the plantation that owned him. Every swing of the hammer reminded him what he had lost. Clara tried to visit once. She walked the 20 miles with the youngest on her hip. The overseer turned her away, said slaves' wives didn't get visiting privileges unless the owner allowed it. She stood at the gate, crying until they threatened to whip her for loitering. She walked home alone. Years passed like that. Elias kept his head down, survived, hoped somehow the truth would come out. Clara raised the children on her own, telling them their father was free and would return one day. She kept his old certificate hidden, afraid to throw it away, afraid to look at it. Why did the system allow this? Money and power. The man who claimed Elias was deep in debt. Seizing a free family meant free labor, no purchase needed. Property law treated people of African descent as presumptively enslaved unless proven otherwise. Once the record was changed, the burden shifted to Elias to prove it wrong, and as a now enslaved person, he had no standing in court to sue for his freedom. Bureaucratic pressure helped too. Clerks were often related to planters or owed them favors. Judges were planters themselves. The law said corrections could be made if new evidence appeared. A sworn statement from one white man was evidence enough. Thousands of free people lost their status. This way, in the decades before the Civil War, some cases made it into appeals, but most didn't. The records were quietly altered, the families scattered, the stories buried in dusty books no one looked at again. That's why Elias's name survived at Orbeckers. One later clerk made a marginal note questioning the correction, and a descendant found it a century later. Most others are lost forever. I think about Elias and Clara often, about how ordinary their lives were until they weren't, about how close any of us are to losing everything on someone else's say-so. We like to think paperwork protects USPA certificates, deeds, titles. But if the people in charge decide to change the story, the paper follows. Elias never got his freedom back in his lifetime. He died on that plantation in 1859, still listed as property. Clara outlived him by 10 years, still telling anyone who would listen that her husband had been born free. Their great-grandchildren finally proved it after emancipation, using the old church records and the clerk's doubtful note. Too late for Elias and Clara, but not too late for us to remember, because remembering is the only way we make sure it can't happen again. Not in the same way, maybe, but systems still find ways to erase people with a stroke of a pen or a click of a keyboard. The details change. The injustice, DOESN, single quotes, thank you for staying with me through this story. If it made you angry, or sad, or thoughtful, that's good. That's the point. These weren't just names in old books. They were husbands, wives, fathers, mothers, people who trusted the system and learned too late how fragile that trust could be. If you want to know more, look up the free Negro registers in Virginia courthouses. Many are online now. Read the lines. Look for the crossings out. You'll find more stories like Elias's waiting there, and ask yourself, what pieces of paper do I trust to protect what matters most to me, and who has the power to change them? Elias believed his papers made him safe. What he didn't know was that the law had already decided otherwise. Here's the part no one explained to Elias. Freedom for black people in Virginia was legal, but only conditionally. The law allowed it, tolerated it even, but it never truly protected it. The courts might recognize your birth record, your church entry, your annual registration, but deep in the code was a quieter rule. People of African descent were presumed enslaved unless they could prove otherwise. Every single time someone asked, freedom existed, but it could be revoked. The law never promised permanence. Think about that for a second. Elias had spent his whole life proving he was free, year after year paying the fee, standing in front of the clerk, showing his face, letting them measure his height, note his scars, all so the certificate could say, born free. Yet the moment a white man with money troubles pointed at him and said he belongs to me, the balance tipped suddenly. All those years of careful proof weren't enough. The burden was always on Elias, not on the man making the claim. And this is where the balance tipped against him, in ways most folks never had to face. One white man's sworn statement was considered evidence enough. The judge didn't need witnesses, didn't need old documents, didn't even need to hear from Elias himself. A simple affidavit saying there had been a mistake years ago, that Sarah wasn't truly free when Elias was born. That was all it took. The clerk opened the ledger, drew a line through the word free, added a new note, and closed the book. From that moment on, Elias wasn't defending his freedom, he was defending his existence, because once the record changed, the law treated him as property, and property can't walk into court and speak for itself. He had no standing to sue, no right to testify on his own behalf. The very system that was supposed to settle disputes had already decided he didn't count as a person in the room. Here's what that really meant. In practice, neighbors who had known him his whole life suddenly couldn't help, even if they wanted to. Their testimony carried less weight than one planter's word. Church records that clearly said free were brushed aside as secondary. The annual certificates he had paid for year after year were declared based on the corrected birth entry. So they too became worthless. Everything he and Sarah and Clara had built to protect their family collapsed under the weight of one man's need for free labor. The law didn't see this as theft, it saw it as correction, a fixing of an old error on paper. No arrest required, no public notice needed. Just a quiet order and a clerk's pen, and a man who woke up free went to sleep belonging to someone else. And the worst part is, Elias wasn't alone. Thousands faced the same quiet erasure in court records. Across the South, you'll find those marginal notes, those crossed out lines, those sudden reclassifications, most without explanation, most without appeal, because once you were listed as property, you lost the right to fight for the truth. That's the hidden cruelty of the system. It didn't need violence in the streets to take a free man. It just needed ink and the willingness to believe one side over the other. And when money was tight, when debts piled up, some men were very willing. Let me slow down here, because this presumption of enslavement wasn't some accident. It was baked into the laws from the earliest days in Virginia. As far back as the 1600s, the colony had rules saying children followed the condition of the mother. So if the mother was free, the child was free. But over time, especially after 1800, the legislature added layer after layer, making it harder to stay free. They required registration. They taxed free blacks heavily. They restricted movement, all while keeping that underlying presumption. If there was any doubt, any question at all, the doubt went against the black person. Imagine living with that every day. Elias did. He knew the stories of families stopped on the road, papers demanded, and sometimes even good papers weren't enough if the patrol didn't like your look, or if someone whispered a claim. He taught his children to be polite, to keep their heads down, to always have the certificate ready. But what he couldn't teach them was how to defend against a change made in secret miles away. The burden of proof being on him meant that freedom wasn't a right, it was a constant performance. Prove it today, prove it tomorrow, prove it again next year. And if you ever slipped, if you missed a registration, if you couldn't pay the tax, or if someone powerful simply decided they wanted your labor, then all the proof in the world could be overturned with one stroke. I've read dozens of these cases in the archives. Some men fought for years, hiring lawyers, borrowing money, begging white neighbors to testify, only to lose because the judge ruled the presumption held. Others never even got a hearing. They were seized, sold south, and gone before family could raise a voice, and the records just show a neat correction, as if nothing human was lost. For Elias, it started with a planter named Harlan, who owed money to creditors and needed assets fast. He dug through old estate papers, found a loose connection to Sarah's past, claimed she had never been properly manumitted, and swore to it. The judge, a man who socialized with Harlan, accepted it, ordered the correction, and that was that. No one notified Elias, no one asked for his side. The ledger changed, and the patrols were sent. Clara's visit to the courthouse wasn't just heartbreaking, it was futile. The clerk didn't argue, he didn't sympathize, he just pointed to the new line and said, "The law is the law." She stood there, holding her children, watching the proof of their life together crossed out in faded ink, and there was nothing she could do. This conditional freedom meant that for people like Elias and Clara, every ordinary moment carried a shadow. They celebrated births, saved for their children's future, worshipped openly, but always with that low worry: what if someone looks at our papers and decides they're not enough? What if tomorrow the ledger changes? And because the burden was always on them to prove their humanity again and again, it wore people down. Some left the state, heading north, where papers mattered less. Others paid extra for duplicate certificates, or had white friends hold copies. But many, like Elias, trusted that doing everything right would be enough, only to learn that right didn't matter when power wanted something else. The law's quiet presumption that black people belonged enslaved unless proven otherwise every single time wasn't just unfair, it was designed to make freedom temporary, to keep a door open for re-enslavement whenever it suited the powerful. And it suited them often, especially in hard economic times, when free black craftsmen like Elias competed for work, or when plantations needed more hands without paying market prices. So when we say freedom was conditional, we mean it was on loan, revocable, not by crime, not by rebellion, but by whim, wrapped in legal language and sealed with a clerk's ordinary pen. Elias's story shows how that revocation felt in real life. One day a husband and father, the next property, without a voice, and the law called it justice. Stay with me, because what comes next is the day that ink dried and Elias's ordinary walk home from work turned into the last free steps he would ever take. The patrols, the seizure, the moment everything changed, and how a family held on to hope, even when the system told them hope was pointless. The moment Elias lost his freedom didn't come with chains, it came with ink. This is the exact moment everything shifted. In a quiet courthouse office, on an ordinary afternoon in 1828, a clerk sat alone at his desk, the room smelling of old paper and lamp oil. He opened a heavy ledger, the one with cracked leather binding, turned slowly to the page listing births from 1805, found the entry for Elias Freeman, son of Sarah, and with steady hand dipped his quill into the inkwell, drew a careful line through the word free. The correction looked small. Its impact was not. Nothing loud happened, and that's why it worked. That single line would outweigh every breath Elias had ever taken. The clerk wiped his quill, set it down, and went on with his day, while miles away, Elias hammered iron, unaware that his life had already been rewritten. The planter Harlan had filed a simple affidavit weeks earlier, claiming an old mistake about Sarah's manumission, saying she had still been enslaved when Elias was born. The judge, a man who dined at Harlan's table, signed off without calling witnesses, without requiring proof beyond that sworn statement. No hearing required, no notice sent to Elias or Clara, and the ink dried while Elias was at the forge, shaping iron for customers who still greeted him as a free man, who trusted him with their tools and their horses. That evening he finished work, wiped the sweat from his brow, slung his tools over his shoulder, and started The familiar walk home, thinking about the supper Clara would have waiting, thinking about reading to the children. By candlelight, thinking about tomorrow's jobs. Elias didn't know it yet, but this would be the last walk he ever took as a free man. The patrols came then, riding up quietly, surrounding him on the dusty road. This is where belief breaks. Elias reached inside his shirt, pulled out his certificate, the one tucked close to his heart. The one he had renewed faithfully every year, paying the fee standing tall while the clerk measured him again. The patrol captain took it, held it to the fading light, glanced at the seal, and said, "It's no good anymore. The record's been corrected. You're coming with us." Elias argued at first, his voice steady because he knew the neighbors knew his life, knew the church, knew the law. He said, "Ask anyone. I've lived here all my days. I've got the papers right here." But paper beat memory. The new entry in the distant ledger outweighed everything he carried, outweighed years of community trust, outweighed the church baptism, outweighed his mother's hard-won freedom. He carried proof. It didn't matter anymore. The captain folded the certificate, put it in his own pocket, and nodded to the others. They tied his hands, not roughly, just efficiently, the rope biting a little into his wrists, and led him away on foot, while one man rode his horse behind. Clara heard the commotion from the cabin, ran out barefoot into the yard, saw the horses, saw the men, saw Elias walking between them, looking back at her, his face confused, more than afraid, trying to mouth something. She couldn't hear the children crowded at the door, crying, "Daddy, Daddy." She gathered them close, held them tight as the dust settled, and the road emptied, and the night came on colder than usual. Clara still believed the system would correct itself. The next morning she walked to the courthouse, with the youngest on her hip and the older children trailing behind, holding hands, determined to fix what had to be a mistake. She had barely slept. The children asking questions all night. Where is Papa? Why did the men take him? When is he coming home? She told them it would be all right. Papa just has to show his papers again, and she believed it, because how could it be otherwise? They had done everything right. She wasn't arguing history. When she stepped into the cool, dim office, she was begging for her family back. The clerk recognized her, pulled out the big book, turned to the page without a word, and there it was, the careful line through free, the new words added, neat and final, as if they had always been there. She touched the page with trembling fingers, asked, "How, when, why?" Without anyone telling us, without giving Elias a chance to speak. The clerk shrugged and said, "Court order, ma'am. Nothing I can do." The book mattered more than the woman standing there, with tears on her face, more than the children clinging to her skirt, more than 23 years of a free life. The record spoke. She didn't. Clara stood there a long time, staring at the ink that had taken her husband, feeling the weight of it settle on her chest. Then she turned, gathered the children, and walked the long road home with questions she couldn't answer, and a silence that grew heavier with every step. Life after re-enslavement wasn't about dramatic beatings. At first it was about slow daily loss. Elias was marched the 20 miles to Harlan's plantation, chained loosely to another man for the journey. When he arrived, they assigned him quarters in the slave row, separate from the family he had known. They saw his blacksmith skills were valuable, so they set him up at the plantation forge. But now every hammer strike reminded him he wasn't working for his family anymore. Every plowshare he repaired, every horseshoe he fitted, every gate hinge he forged, went to enrich the man who had changed the record. This wasn't punishment in the usual sense. It was extraction, taking a man's labor, his knowledge, his strength, his pride, and turning it against the life he had built. Freedom teaches you what you've lost, and Elias felt it with every swing of the hammer, every spark that flew, every blister on hands that once earned wages for his children's shoes. He couldn't walk freely anymore. Every move off the plantation needed a written pass signed by the overseer. He couldn't earn money to send home. He couldn't slip away to see Clara and the children. He couldn't protect them from a distance. If he spoke out of turn, the overseer reminded him with a lash or a threat, but mostly it was the quiet erosion. No more choosing his work, no more coming home to his own table, no more planning for the future with Clara, no more looking his children in the eye as a free man who could promise them the same. The days blurred into seasons, the forge fire hot on his face, the nights cold in the small cabin where he slept alone, listening to unfamiliar voices around him. Clara tried to visit once after months had passed. She saved every coin she could from washing and cooking, walked those 20 miles. Carrying the baby on her hip, the older children staying with a neighbor, she arrived dusty and exhausted at the plantation gate, hopeful for just a glimpse. The overseer met her, shook his head, said no visiting for slave wives unless the owner says so, and the owner wasn't there. She stood there pleading, tears running down her cheeks, telling him about the children, about how Elias was free, about the papers, but he cut her off, said she was disturbing the peace, threatened to have her whipped for loitering. She turned back, walked the whole way home, alone, the baby crying from hunger, the road longer than ever, the children waiting at the door, asking, "Did you see Papa? When is he coming?" She held them and said soon, but the word felt hollow. Why Elias could never fight back legally is the cruelest part of all once enslaved. He had no voice. You can't challenge a system that erased your standing. The law closed the door behind him and locked it. Enslaved people couldn't sue in court on their own, couldn't testify against whites in freedom cases, couldn't hire lawyers without a white guardian. Any petition had to come from a white person willing to speak for them, and few were willing when it meant going against a powerful planter with debts and influence. Clara tried desperately. She asked neighbors. She scraped together coins for legal advice. She even wrote letters begging for help, but every door shut. Every lawyer said, "The record stands, the correction is final." The law listened only to the book. Not to her grief, not to the children's questions, not to 23 years of lived freedom. Elias from the plantation could do even less. Any attempt to run or resist meant sail farther south or worse, so he kept his head down, survived, carried the weight inside, hoped against reason that somehow the truth would surface. Maybe a new judge, maybe a witness, maybe mercy, but none came. Years passed like that. Clara raised the children on her own, working harder, aging faster, telling them bedtime stories of the father who was free, who had taught them to read, who would return one day. She kept his old certificate hidden in a tin box under the bed, touching it sometimes, running her fingers over the faded seal, feeling the paper that once protected them, now worthless against the new line in the ledger. Elias grew quieter, the fire in his eyes dimmed, but never gone. He remembered every detail of his free life and held it close on the longest nights. Elias wasn't unique in this. Thousands disappeared the same way. Quiet corrections in ledgers across Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, free people seized on flimsy paper claims, families broken without a public trial, without headlines, without graveside justice, most names crossed out and forgotten, only a few like Elias left a faint trace, a marginal note from a later clerk who paused and wrote questionable, or a descendant centuries on who found the discrepancy and fought to restore the truth. Most others vanished completely, their stories buried under neat ink lines, no appeal, no trace, no one to tell their children what really happened. That's what makes this story hard to hear and harder to forget. It wasn't rare, it was routine. When debts piled up, when cotton prices rose, when a free black craftsman like Elias competed too well or simply existed as convenient labor, the ledger offered a clean, legal way to claim him. Systems don't need to hate you to erase you. They only need permission, and the law gave permission freely, quietly, efficiently. I think about Elias and Clara, whenever I hold my own papers, driver's license, birth certificate, social security, card deeds to a house, things we trust without, question to say who we are, where we belong, what is ours, but Elias trusted too, he renewed on time lived, quietly paid his heavy taxes, raised his family, right, and still one stroke of ink took it all away. We tell ourselves it couldn't happen. Now laws are different, protections, stronger, but systems still shift rules, still change records, still get corrected, databases altered, identities challenged, and the burden still too often falls on the vulnerable to prove over and over that they belong, that they count, that their story is the true one. Elias Freeman wasn't forgotten. By accident, he was corrected out of existence. His name lingered faintly only because one later clerk paused long enough to scribble a doubtful note in the margin, and because great-grandchildren, generations later, fought through archives to reclaim the truth. But most weren't so lucky, most were erased completely. The books closed, the plantations worked, the families scattered, and the world moved on as if they had never been free at all. And even after Elias was gone, the ink kept working, long after the man was buried.